In my dissertation, I was actually really interested in checking the relationship between active learning elements, and in particular, and motivation. And that was the topic of my dissertation, the effects of task-centered versus top-centered instructional strategy and approaches on problem-solving, learning to program in Flash. So what was the purpose of my study? So the purpose was to investigate whether a task-centered approach might be superior to a topic-centered approach for problem-solving, and also to attempt to reveal the emotional and cognitive processes behind complex learning in the domain of technological skills. So this is the theoretical framework that I created for this study, and it builds on Bandura's triadic reciprocality. So we have the performance, and we have, so this is, you can look at it as the behavior, and we have the task-centered instruction. You can look at the environment. And now this is all of this thing in the middle relates to the person itself. So we have cognitive considerations, like what is the schema that we currently have and the cognitive load that we are experiencing. And we have motivational considerations, which include interest and value, and like what we called before expectancy, and here I refer to it as self-efficacy. Now, my hypothesis was that the task-centered instructional strategy will result in two things. So first, in terms of cognitive consideration, it will help the students build a schema, and as a result will reduce the cognitive load. In terms of motivational considerations, because the task-centered instructional approach starts with a simple task and progresses to a more and more difficult task, it will help increase self-efficacy because they are experiencing positive actual experiences. So because they're starting with a simple task, they will probably succeed in completing it, increasing their self-efficacy. Now, there is a lot of literature showing that self-efficacy results in better performance. And also there is a lot of literature showing that high cognitive load results in lower performance, and vice versa. So what will be the result is a loop. So for example, let's say that the task-centered increases self-efficacy, which will increase performance, which will then again increase self-efficacy, because the performance is actual experience, which results in higher self-efficacy. But it will also have an effect on schema construction, because when I'm doing something, I'm actually building a schema in my head, which will then reduce cognitive load, which will then increase performance, which will then again increase self-efficacy, and so on. So that was my research design. I compared two conditions. So in the first, I taught exactly the same content. So you see, exactly the same content, but only in the task-centered condition, I taught it in the context of 3 tasks, and in the topic-centered condition, I taught it by topics. So first I taught the first topic, which has to do with timeline in Flash, and then I taught the second topic, which has to do with text, and then the third topic, which has to do with buttons. Whereas here in the task-centered condition, you see that even at the first task, I touched on 3 different topics. So like the first element of the timeline, and the first element of text, and the first element of buttons. So what I measured was performance, cognitive load, time on task, confidence, and computer anxiety and self-efficacy. So all of these measures has to do with self-efficacy. So what did I find? So first I looked at cognitive load. So you see here there are 3 parts of the module. So part 1, part 2, and part 3. So for the task-centered, the task is here at white. Part 1 was task 1, and part 2 was task 2, and part 3 was task 3. And you see that their cognitive load was actually higher than the topic-centered. And why was that? I mean, because they really learned about here 3 new topics and they were not yet connected to each other. So the cognitive load was pretty high, whereas the topic-centered students learned only about 1 topic. So it was a little bit easier for them. Now, when they got to part 3, which refers to the most difficult topic, you can see that there was a shift. So actually here, the topic-centered approach had higher cognitive load, whereas the task-centered approach, which already had a schema built in part 1 and part 2, their cognitive load was actually a lot lower. And these are the 3 tests that I gave them after they completed the module. So first I measured skill development, then near transfer. So that's a task that is similar to what they did, and far transfer, which is a task that is more complex or a little bit different than what they learned in the class. And the skill development is really like the specific thing that they learned about the content. Now I looked at their confidence. So what did I find? So even though the confidence, the cognitive load was higher for the task-centered, their confidence was not lower. It was actually not significantly higher here, but a little bit higher, but significantly higher than the topic-centered condition on task 3, on part 3 of the module. And there was not a big difference on the post-test. Now, in terms of performance, on the first 2 modules, there was actually not a big difference in performance. But when they got to part 3, which is the hardest topic, the task-centered, which had task 3, performed a lot better, as you see, than the topic condition. Now, if you look at the post-test, you see that there was a significant difference in performance, and the people at the task-centered condition performed significantly better. So the topic-centered condition and the task-centered at about the same level of computer anxiety before they started the module. Whereas after they finished the module, you can see that the topic-centered still had about the same level of computer anxiety, whereas the task-centered, who actually had a lot of actual experience and a positive experience, so their computer anxiety actually decreased. Looking at the computer self-efficacy, it was again the same trend. So the task-centered instructional strategy showed an increase in computer self-efficacy, whereas there was no difference in the topic-centered condition. So really what I showed was really what I expected, that in the task-centered approach, self-efficacy increased, which resulted in increased performance. And also their schema evolved, which resulted in eventually lower cognitive load, which again increased their performance, which again increased their self-efficacy, and so on.